Chaska had one of the longest running brickyards in the state of Minnesota. This video focuses on the production years of 1866 to 1871. During this period of time, St. Paul remained the largest city in the state. Here's a bird's eye perspective of St. Paul from 1867. One thing to note is the larger, higher quality buildings evident in the core of the city. The various modes of transportation are also shown. Steamboats were still common, and St. Paul had constructed a wagon bridge across the Mississippi River. However, the biggest change was the advent of railroads. This is a bird's eye view of St. Anthony and Minneapolis from 1867. Both of these cities were known for their milling district. However, like St. Paul, they also had a wagon bridge which crossed Nicollet Island. Similar to St. Paul, new railroads could be seen, but there was also a railroad bridge across the Mississippi River between St. Anthony and Minneapolis. The city of Shakopee, a few miles downstream from Chaska, on the Minnesota River, also had a brand new railroad line. All three of these cities were growing, but what types of businesses were they attracting? This graphic shows the top 13 occupations in St. Paul in 1866. Retail stores and manufacturing jobs led the way, but there were plenty of saloons, liquor stores, and gaming establishments. The name Chaska comes from a Native American word that translates to eldest son. Chaska wasn't the oldest settlement along the Minnesota River, but it was growing. By 1871, it featured a county courthouse, Moravian and Catholic churches, Moravian and public schools, 2 breweries, 3 flour mills, and a weekly newspaper. Like the town pictured here, most of Chaska's early development was clustered along the Minnesota River. Most of the early residents of Chaska made their money off the abundant natural resources in the Minnesota River Valley and adjacent countryside. Throughout the 1866 to 1871 period, the main Chaska exports were wheat, wood, hoop poles, ginseng, brick, and cranberries. From episode 1 of this video series, the 1857 Chaska population was 152. Most of these folks came from Germany, although a good number came from New England. By 1860, after Germany, most residents came from Switzerland or France. By 1870, the population had reached 847, and the percentage from Germany was down to about half. Immigrants from Holland now made up the second largest group. In 1857, males outnumbered females by about 2 to 1. That percentage had shrunk by 1860, then stayed about the same through 1870. The 1857 census showed that most Chaska residents were between 20 and 39 years of age. By 1860, most Chaska residents still remained in that same age group. However, the 1860 graphic also showed that the new residents were having children. By 1870, the family groups were getting even larger. As mentioned earlier, the main change between 1866 and 1871 was the expansion of railroads. In addition to becoming the primary means of transportation, they also brought in supplies and hauled out exports. This chart shows the miles of railroad track constructed in Minnesota by year. In 1862, the first 13 miles were built. The St. Paul and Pacific Railroad constructed that first 13 miles of railroad track, which connected St. Paul and St. Anthony. This was a big event in the history of the state. An excursion train was formed and pulled by the locomotive William Crooks from St. Paul to St. Anthony. It was hoped that someday this line would extend all the way to the west coast. One of the first big obstacles to that plan was the need to build a railroad bridge across the Mississippi River to Minneapolis. This was accomplished on May 1, 1867, when 2 bridge sections were completed across the Mississippi River, using Nicollet Island as the midpoint. This allowed the St. Paul and Pacific Railroad to continue building westward. A second railroad, the Minnesota Central, landed a locomotive on a barge near Mendota on August 8, 1864. They named this locomotive Washington. From Mendota, the Minnesota Central Railroad built southward to Farmington. This section was completed around June 30, 1865. The next segment was completed to Owatonna, where the Minnesota Central connected with the Winona and St. Peter Railroad to Winona. Future sections were completed to Austin, where connections could be made to McGregor, Iowa, and Milwaukee, Wisconsin. However, to connect directly with Minneapolis and St. Paul from the Minnesota Central, railroad bridges had to be completed across the Minnesota and Mississippi rivers. The first bridge built was across the Minnesota River between Mendota and Fort Snelling, around September 14, 1865. Spiles used in the construction of this bridge were harvested from trees in Carver County. Spiles were wood timbers driven into the ground to support the weight of the trestle and bridge. This gave the Minnesota Central a direct connection with Minneapolis on September 26, 1865. A third railroad, the Minnesota Valley, landed the locomotive Mankato near the Credit River in early June 1865. Thousands of railroad ties were needed to build this railroad line, and Carver and Scott counties helped to supply them. One segment of the Minnesota Valley Railroad was built from the Credit River to Mendota, while the other segment was built from the Credit River to Shakopee. Both portions were completed in late 1865, leading to an excursion train of St. Paul dignitaries from Mendota to Shakopee to see the new line for themselves. The Minnesota Valley Railroad pushed west from Shakopee to Merriam around October 19, 1866. Here a depot was built for the towns of Chaska and Carver, which were located on the other side of the river. Residents of the area could not wait to hear the first whistle of the iron horse. From Merriam, the Minnesota Valley Railroad pushed to the southwest, reaching Jordan and Belle Plaine before the end of 1866. Once again, a special excursion train was put together of St. Paul dignitaries to see the end of the line at Belle Plaine. It took until September 1869 for the St. Paul Railroad Bridge to be built, connecting it with Mendota. Once again, spiles from the Chaska area were used in its construction. On September 18, 1869, the track and bridge were ready for use. A fourth railroad, the Hastings and Dakota, was begun at Hastings, Minnesota. On October 18, 1868, the locomotive John B. Alley was transported on barges to Hastings. One of the first challenges was to build a railroad bridge across the Vermilion River. From that point, track was laid southwest to Farmington, where the Hastings and Dakota connected with the Minnesota Central. From Farmington, the Hastings and Dakota built westward to the Credit River in the fall of 1869. The St. Paul, Milwaukee, and Chicago Railroad also built a segment from St. Paul to the opposite shore of Hastings, which was opened for service on December 13, 1869. Once again, another railroad bridge had to be completed across the Mississippi River, this time at Hastings. This bridge was completed on December 9, 1871. This bird's eye view shows the town of Hastings and the Hastings Railroad Bridge. Technically, in 1867, the bridge was not yet built, so the artist of this bird's eye view is not totally accurate. The railroad continued building southeast along the west bank of the Mississippi River to Winona and then to La Crosse. There, the railroad made connections to Milwaukee and Chicago. Going back to the miles of railroad track constructed in Minnesota, you can see how the number increased each year. By 1871, 1,612 miles of track were laid. 1871 was also a big railroad year for Chaska. The Hastings and Dakota Railroad planned to extend its line from Credit River to Shakopee, through Chaska and Carver, and west to Cologne. Meanwhile, the Minneapolis and St. Louis Railroad planned to build a route from Minneapolis to Chaska and Carver, then southward through Jordan. Both of these routes required railroad bridges across the Minnesota River. The Hastings and Dakota would build its bridge near Chaska, while the Minneapolis and St. Louis would cross the Minnesota River at Carver. Both bridges would be nearly identical. For steamboats to pass, a swing bridge was required, anchored by a center pier near the middle of the river. Not surprisingly, the same companies built both bridges. The American Bridge Company, led by L.B. Boomer, built the superstructures, while R.B. Langdon and Company built the foundations. The Carver Bridge was finished on November 5, 1871, and the Chaska Bridge was finished 3 days later. The cost of each bridge was about $40,000. The Minneapolis and St. Louis Railroad reached Chaska on October 31, 1871. The local newspaper noted that the residents of Chaska received them with unbounded joy. The line was extended to Carver on November 2nd. This led to a special excursion train from Minneapolis to Carver, composed of Minneapolis dignitaries, for a large reception. From Carver, the railroad was extended to the old Minnesota Valley Railroad, which had become the St. Paul and Sioux City Railroad. The old Merriam Depot was then moved to this junction, but it kept the name Merriam or Sioux City Junction. The Minneapolis and St. Louis Railroad gave Chaska another connection to Minneapolis, White Bear, Stillwater, and Duluth. The Hastings and Dakota Railroad built through Shakopee and reached Chaska on November 15, 1871, roughly 2 weeks after the Minneapolis and St. Louis Railroad. The train was again greeted by the citizens of Chaska, their band, and plenty of beer. The railroads brought goods to the people of the Minnesota Valley, but what did the people of the Minnesota Valley export? In 1867, this graphic shows what the main exports were: wood, hoop poles, lime, and brick. Wood was used in the larger cities as fuel, hoop poles were used to build wooden barrels, and lime and brick were used in construction. The railroads quickly became the primary means of travel. However, they also aided in the settlement of the state. Most of the early railroads were land-grant railroads, meaning that to help fund their construction, they were given land along their routes to sell. Like this map shows, the Minnesota Valley Railroad was given thousands of acres along its path. The St. Paul and Pacific Railroad was also given thousands of acres of land. Now let's look at the supply and demand factors for the Chaska Brickyards between 1866 and 1871. Starting with the price of the goods, remember that brick were sold at a flat rate per 1,000. In the late 1860s, the price came down a little, to around $8 per thousand. This would correspond to about $140 in 2020. If the brick had to be transported out of Chaska, a transportation fee would be tacked on. The method of transport could be by horse and wagon or barge. In 1867, that extra fee was about $5 per thousand brick. So why had the price dropped? In 1870, Chaska and Carver County produced 3,750,000 brick. However, other brickyards had also popped up, and other established brickyards were producing greater numbers of brick. Minneapolis was the largest brick producer. Minneapolis brick were not widely used in St. Paul, as it was still hard to get the brick there cheaply, and St. Paul and Minneapolis were in direct competition with each other. These graphics show how the brick produced at the 3 Chaska brickyards were used in 1866. Some didn't sell, some brick were used locally, but the majority of brick produced was exported to St. Paul and other river cities. There were changes involved in the cost of production. Since the Chaska brickyards were now well established, there were no startup costs. However, there were still operating expenses. In 1867, brickyard workers earned about $25 per month, including board. These men worked 6 10-hour days with Sundays off, which essentially equated to about $1 a day. Of the natural conditions, floods could often do the most damage. The brickyards were still located in a flood-prone area on the east side of Chaska. Floods tended to wash away stacks of wood that were used to burn the brick. Finally, floods even shut down portions of the Minnesota Valley Railroad. Adding to the river problems were periods of low water levels. During these times, just about all steamboat traffic and the movement of heavy barges stopped. One of the biggest technology changes was the use of steam power in the brickyards. Howe & Sons bought a portable steam engine that they used to cut wood. Other than adding steam power, brick manufacturing still required 6 steps. Clay still had to be mined from the pit, weathered through a winter, and mixed with sand and water. In 1866, the National Brick Machine was unveiled. This brick machine could mold bricks faster than a man. At top efficiency, it could make 30,000 brick per day. The steamboat Molly Moeller brought the first brick machine to Chaska to be used in the Griggs and Griggs Brickyard. The National Brick Machine could be powered by steam or a horse team through the gearbox at the top. First, the clay, sand, and water mixture were fed into the top of the machine. Then the mix was blended and pushed into a brick mold of 6 bricks. The brick mold was then expelled out the bottom. This process did not necessarily cut down on the manpower required to make the brick. Rather, it allowed them to make more brick. 7 men were required to run the National Brick Machine. 3 trucks were needed to offload brick, and 17 brick molds were needed to keep the cycle going. What did those 7 men do? Men had to tend the horses, feed the clay mixture into the machine, sand the molds, insert the molds, remove the molds, and man the trucks. Another type of brick machine, called a brick press, was introduced in the Chaska Brickyards in 1870. This machine was designed to make sharper corners on brick. Using the old method, the brickmaker pressed the clay mixture into the brick mold using his own power. This would produce a satisfactory brick, but it usually had rough edges. The brick press was designed to press the brick with more force from all angles, which resulted in a brick that had sharp, crisp edges. Once either machine had formed the brick, they still had to be dried on the ground, then stacked in a kiln and fired for several days. The 2 main transport mechanisms between 1866 and 1871 were horses and barges. Some of the new barges that were being made were quite large. The Little Mac, made for Griggs and Newcomb, was 140 feet long. That is roughly half a football field in length. Despite 2 railroads having reached Chaska in the fall of 1871, the brickmaking season was essentially over by then. Looking at factor prices and their availability, there were subtle changes there too. Some of the brickyards expanded their operations by starting a second yard. Like this photograph shows, 3 separate brick manufacturing spaces were created at one location. When adding a second yard, the most space was taken up by drying bricks. To add a new space, the top had to be cleared of all trees, stumps, rocks, and grass. Then it had to be leveled and shaped for proper drainage. To make sure the water flowed quickly away from the drying brick, trenches roughly 10 inches wide by 4 inches deep were dug in segments like the 4 shown here. These segments were roughly 50 feet wide. Griggs, and Newcomb set up a new yard that could accommodate 60,000 drying brick. The main government policy in this period was the end of the Civil War. Minnesota sent a large number of soldiers to fight in the war, and several thousand of them died in the conflict. Since fewer men returned, there were less available laborers. Finally, let's take a look at the prices of related goods. The St. Paul Press did complain about the high price of building materials, as did the Chaska Herald. If prices were better, even more building may have been done. As for the demand factors, we already mentioned that the price of Chaska bricks had dropped in 1866. As for the second factor, the income of buyers, an upward trend could be seen in the money spent on St. Paul buildings from 1867 to 1871. The prices of related goods were variable, but they were starting to be affected by the next category, the preferences of consumers. Deadly fires in towns and cities across the country were becoming more common, somewhat due to poor construction, but also due to the large number of wooden buildings erected in close proximity of each other. In May 1866, a deadly fire swept through Hudson, Wisconsin. In February 1869, the International Hotel in St. Paul burned down. Minneapolis had a large fire that destroyed a business complex in 1870. The following year, a fire destroyed 2 business blocks in Hastings, Minnesota. The largest and deadliest fire occurred in 1871 at Chicago. 2,600 acres of buildings were destroyed, and 80,000 people were displaced by that fire. News of the fire made headlines across the country and put fear into people. The result was new codes and zoning laws in cities. In certain sections of the larger cities, it became illegal to erect any building that did not have brick or stone outer walls. Fire wardens were hired to inspect and regulate all buildings. This gave an immediate boost to the brick industry. Between 1867 and 1869, brick imports to St. Paul nearly doubled each year. By the early 1870s, there were signs of even better growth. St. Paul newspapers believed they had an industrious and thrifty population in place. The Chaska newspaper said that the farmers of Carver County were doing very well financially, and the prospect of rail connection with the outside world in 1871 would bring new wealth to town. So conditions were ripe for an explosion of prosperity and growth. Now let's look at the year-by-year statistics for 1866 to 1871. The only brick manufacturer to have a yard open every year was Lucius Howe, although in 1870 he rented one of his yards to John Nunzinger, and in 1871 he rented a yard to Mack and Bongard. Getz and Foos opened a brickyard that only lasted for 1 year. Foos was also involved in wood, lime, and barges. Foos was also a good advertiser, as shown by this newspaper printed in German. Remember, the numbers in red on this chart are the numbers of employees of each brickyard. In 1866 and 1867, Gregg and Griggs had the largest brickyard in Chaska. The biggest news after the 1867 brick season was Gregg and Griggs selling out to Howe & Sons. Gregg had taken a contract in Stillwater, Minnesota, to make brick for the new Washington County Courthouse. Griggs and Newcomb had become involved with James J. Hill, an industrious St. Paul businessman who would later become one of the most widely known Minnesotans. The trio formed a business known as Hill, Griggs & Company. In addition to Hill, Griggs, and Newcomb, John F. Miller of Chaska and Carver was also heavily involved. In 1870, James J. Hill was 32 years old and was worth about $35,000. Chauncey Griggs was 37 in 1870 and was worth about $50,000. The oldest of the trio in 1870 was William Newcomb at 39, who was worth $31,500. Although not an owner, John Miller was 34 in 1870 and held prominent positions with the company. The Hill, Griggs & Company office was located in St. Paul. James J. Hill had a warehouse right at the levee where steamboats could offload supplies to waiting teams or railroad cars. Hill, Griggs & Company were involved in several enterprises, but the main one was wood and coal. They received an exclusive contract from the St. Paul and Pacific Railroad for dealing in wood. All wood purchased along that railroad line had to go through their company. A secondary business for Hill, Griggs & Company was dealing in brick. In 1868, the company purchased and operated a brickyard in Carver. A year later, they opened a brickyard southwest of Minneapolis, along the St. Paul and Pacific Railroad. This brickyard was located on the southwest side of Cedar Lake, in Hennepin County. Looking at 1857 to 1871, Gregg and Howe had each been involved in brick manufacturing about the same number of years, although neither for the entire time. So did brick manufacturing pay off for either of these men? This graphic compares the wealth change for 10 Chaska residents between 1860 and 1870. Lucius Howe was one of these residents. His wealth in 1860 was $1,850. By 1870, it shot up to $21,500. Howe was not solely involved in brick manufacturing. He also dealt in wood, barges, and real estate. The combination of his business interests resulted in the greatest wealth change of these 10 Chaska residents. Other than Lucius Howe, the other 9 people were a combination of farmers, lawyers, hotel operators, carpenters, and merchants. The 3 main Chaska merchants also made a lot of money between 1860 and 1870. The farmers and lawyer also grew their wealth. Only 2 of these Chaska residents experienced tough times. Lucius Howe's $21,500 in 1870 would be worth about $421,000 in 2020. So Lucius Howe was a very wealthy man. Lucy and Warner also started a brickyard in Chaska in 1870. Warner did not live in Chaska in 1860, but he was worth $10,000 in 1870, so he was also a man of means. The Chaska Brickyards were still located along the eastern edge of Chaska between 1866 and 1871. Now let's take a look at population trends. The population of Chaska is shown by the numbers above the green columns. So the population of Chaska in 1870 was 847, only a slight growth from 1865. The populations of St. Paul and Minneapolis can be inferred by the scale on the left. St. Paul is the red line, and it showed continued growth to around 20,000 by 1870. Minneapolis, the blue line, also showed growth to around 13,000 by 1870. Next, let's look at brickyard statistics. The number of Chaska brickyards is shown by the number above the cream-colored boxes. As an example, there were 3 brickyards in 1866. The scale for the number of bricks produced during the year is shown on the left. By 1870, Chaska produced about 3.7 million brick. Remember, the Civil War ended in 1866, and 2 railroads were completed to Chaska in 1871. Prospects for the future of brick production in Chaska looked really good. The Chaska brick produced during this time frame were used in more areas and at further distances from Chaska. The Stout Building in Lake City, Minnesota was constructed of Chaska brick. After the Hudson, Wisconsin fire, Chaska Brick helped rebuild portions of that town. A 3-story hotel in Hudson was built of Chaska Brick. St. Paul still garnered the most Chaska Brick. The new Metropolitan Hotel in St. Paul used 800,000 Chaska Brick. Of course, Chaska Brick were used locally as well. The Gustav Krahenbuhl residence in Chaska, among other buildings, were built of local brick. To close this video, here's a quote from a long-time brickmaker. That concludes the video. Please check out my websites at mnbricks.com and chaskabrick.com.